So if you guys can all hear me, this is Julia Santagata, one of the automation managers here at Rumsey. Looking forward to chatting with everybody today with one of our speakers, Mace Bittman, who's an automation specialist, has been with us quite some time. Topic for today is ControlLogix redundancy. We did not mute everybody. If you can mute yourselves, that would be great. But feel free to unmute at any time. We do want to have everybody ask as many questions as they'd like to. Ideally, this would be as interactive as possible. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Mace. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Yes, today we're going to talk about ControlLogix redundancy, one of my favorite features of Rockwell Automation / Allen Bradley hardware. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Mace Bittman. I am the PLC HMI software specialist. Been with doing this for about a little over 20 years now with automation controls in general, various experiences. And then I was with another distributor for 10 years, and that's where all my experiences come from, as well as being with an OEM for +5. So for those of you that are OEM people online, welcome, but I've been on your side of the fence, some of your challenges that you have. So that's one of the reasons I enjoy doing these kind of seminars, to help you as well as everybody else. All right. Quick table of contents. I briefly go through ControlLogix history with a slide, talk about what redundancy is, a little bit under the hood of actual mechanics or functionality, if you will. Then CompactLogix is often a question, and then also some of the steps, or actually these steps, to go to set up a ControlLogix redundancy system. Fortunately for a lot of you, this is actually a much easier situation than it has been in the past. So if some of you have tried ControlLogix redundancy setups and had any issues, or maybe even took a long time, the later versions really have improved, especially the versions I'm going to be talking about. Oh, I think somebody does need to mute there, please. Okay, and then the other items I'm going to just talk about is how to get started with the actual program in itself. Show you how you can see the status of the redundancy system in RSLinx Classic. A few things I'll just point out and note. Where to start. So I'll give you a starting bill of materials. Then some sample code that I created years ago that is very popular, and you're certainly welcome to it if you set up one of these systems. Quick mention about redundancy power supplies. Some people aren't even aware of this, even if it's not a ControlLogix processor redundancy system. And also a brief mentioning in one slide about the I/O you can remotely control. All right, let's talk about history real quick. First generation years ago came out with the single core processors. Some of you might remember the very old L55s, but specifically the L6 anything is what most people refer to when they talk about ControlLogix redundancy. This would be version 16, for instance, a very popular revision. If you notice, these are all discontinued. If any of you have these in service, please contact us to get these out of service so you can get something that is actually shipping today. Now, with that said, the second generation is the L7 family. These have dual cores. They got rid of the serial ports to make them function faster, with a convenient USB port on the face so you can instantly connect to them without any other devices such as a serial connection. Then there's the fourth gen, been out for a few years now, the L8s, and of course the S's with safety. I do have a couple mentions on how those are supported very soon. Quick snapshot of what they look like, a little bigger view for somebody that never seen ControlLogix before. Specifically, what we're going to talk about is the L7s, which is that top section. As you can see, the L557 zeros. All right, so what is redundancy? In short, it's a duplication of the ControlLogix racks. They're nicknamed hosts. Some documentation shows it. And you're talking to Rockwell or other people, they usually call them hosts. But the bottom line is that would be the pair of processors that are for your control system. Then you're going to have two PLCs in the host racks. You'll have communication modules. At minimum, most people would want to have two Ethernet modules. Then you'll have power supplies. So again, all the host racks are going to have these minimum components to have a redundancy system. A little more visual for you. As they show on the right, they show 2 controllers and 4 communication modules, and then the duplicate in the secondary chassis. They are connected with an RM2 module. I go through some details on that. In short, today, the latest version is version 32. It supports 2 controllers and 7 communication modules. So that does mean you could have 7 Ethernet modules in the primary and secondary rack. No I/O goes in these racks. Keep that in mind. It's always remotely controlled your I/O. So real quick, this is a full redundancy system. This is not a standby, wait a few minutes. This is instant. Both chassis have to match. That means if you have 2 controllers in the primary, it has to be in the secondary and so on. When you're running the system, it's completely transparent externally, except for one thing I mentioned later. They switch the addresses. I also show how there's no special code. And the crossover, some people call it switchover, is very, very quick. Their spec is saying, not so much guaranteeing, but it's suggesting that it's very likely to be under 20 milliseconds. I've seen it as little as 5. Programming, if you've done ControlLogix before, there's nothing else different for the most part, except for a few things I mentioned. This whole piece of redundancy for ControlLogix is one piece of the whole high availability system. As you can see, computers, networking systems, DLR, redundant connections, and so on to remotely controlled devices. All right, status. Let's take a quick snapshot of what you physically see in the racks. The primary rack will have a redundancy module, and it's going to show PRIM as in primary. That is the redundancy module giving you the information of which rack is the primary host. Then you'll have a secondary rack. This shows sync, SY and C, as you can see. Also, the secondary module is monitoring the primary. So that's what its job is to be ready to take over if need be. The PLCs in the second rack are constantly updating its program to match. That's what it's part of that whole crossover 20 milliseconds as well. It will not cross until the whole program in the secondary is completely mirrored and copied from the primary, and a few other things that go on in it as well. All addresses in the Ethernet or ControlNet, so far as version 32, it does still support ControlNet. The addresses jump up one address, and I talk about that a little bit later, but in short, if you had, let's say, ending at 190 for your Ethernet address, your secondary is 191, and then they flip. Now, this is important. I mentioned this briefly, but now I want to nail down a little bit more. If you're using RSLinx Classic or FactoryTalk Links and browsing, if you're using, for instance, FactoryTalk View Machine Edition to set up your shortcut, you want to make sure you don't connect to the second redundancy rack. That is just a ghost, and you want to treat it as such, even though one of the few places you have evidence of it is RSLinx Classic. All right, switch over. This is where the primary becomes the secondary. The sync rack now controls everything as the primary. The new primary rack now possesses those addresses. So that's why I was talking about the flipping of the addresses. It's instant. Okay. When this happens, again, it's usually under 20. I've seen many cases under 5. All devices, such as VFD drives, remotely controlled I/O, almost all other third-party devices don't notice the bump, because it's simply the controllers are reading and writing to those devices, and just because the IP address disappeared doesn't mean anything to what's being controlled. I do have to say most cases to be safe here, though. Now, some Ethernet switches, depending on how the layers, they might notice a bump because when that IP address is switched, it is not changing the hardware embedded MAC addresses, okay? Now, some HMIs, and it's not uncommon to have a PAMV Plus, for instance, connected to the redundancy system, and you'll just briefly notice where that little information screen comes up. As soon as you're able to hit close, you'll notice that it's already reconnected. It's very, very, very fast, but because it is a class 3 device, for the most part, that's why it occurs. All right, switchover. What causes it to occur? If the primary network is unplugged or becomes defective, whatever the case is, because it's monitoring everything, that host, it will flip. Any COM module failure. So most common when I see this happen, somebody uses a non-Allen Bradley switch, some sort of spike goes into the Ethernet module, zings it out. If that becomes unhealthy, again, it causes a switchover to go to the secondary. The primary rack's power supply might fail. Unlikely, but it can happen. The rack failure itself, the rack that the primary's in, if that fails. And then, of course, the PLC itself. I put these in my personal findings over all the years of occurring. This is pretty much in the likelihood of failures. And honestly, PLCs never really fail for the most part. It's usually lightning strikes, catastrophic other events, water, submersion, things like that. Let's deep dive a little more. Under the hood, again, the sync PLC takes over the primary as long as the sync's healthy, and that's important. So in other words, if you're looking at your ControlLogix racks and you don't see sync, and the one processor set is saying primary, it will not switch over unless that sync is healthy. So then you'll just have it fault if there's some issue, okay? Again, if the primary email has, for instance, a ControlNet or Ethernet module, when you see the IP addresses or the node address, they will increase by 1 when they're set up. The primary rack gets checked for its health. The new primary rack, when it was sync, now becomes the prime, as I talked about. Unless it has an issue, again, then you'll just have the system stall out. IO VFDs will not notice this new host again. All right, it's 20 milliseconds. That's pretty much what we're saying at the minimum that it'll cross over. Now these RM2s, they have 1 gigabit per second connections between the two. That's one of the reasons you're able to sync so quickly. Now I often get asked, what about ControlLogix? Well, you won't see any ControlLogix in the future. And the main reason, my friends, is because this is a machine level designed classification of processor. It is not designed for enterprise level to take control of many, many other systems and all that. Sure, it has a lot of horsepower. You could do an awful lot of features, especially with the new 5069 class, but that's not specifically what this is designed for. ControlLogix hardware has an awful lot of extra feature sets, especially the Ethernet modules. Again, for that IP swapping capability is just one of the other feature sets. You also see health and status in Ethernet modules in a redundant system as this transition occurs. So let's go through the steps. First of all, you want to decide what version you need. As with any logic system, you have to pick a version. In this instance, we're going to talk about 31, but 32 is extremely similar to version 31. This PowerPoint I created, I'm going to reference version 32051 for the most part, but again, I intermix a little data from 31. For our purposes today, it's really the same. Now, what do I mean by kit? This is very, very important, my friends. This kit contains the firmware that was all tested together. It is recommended that you follow all of these revisions and you set all the modules to what's listed in the kit. What do I mean by that? Here's what the release notes are looking like. For instance, the EN2T, it wants to be flashed to 5.008, not higher, not the later version, specifically 5.008 for this particular version of kit 32.051. This is the only version, okay? I can't stress this enough. This is probably the most common call I get from people having trouble after they bought the components and trying to set this up themselves. Now, 5028, this is a digitally signed system. Nothing wrong with doing that. Just keep in mind, if you commit the modules to digitally signed, they will stay that way. So in other words, you cannot change it back to a non-digitally signed firmware set, but if a new digitally signed firmware comes out, you can certainly upgrade it to that same type of classification of firmware. Let's look at another one. I point this one out specifically because the RM2s are usually shipped with something later. I believe it's 21 even that the firmware is shipped with today. But either way, if it is 20, if you receive it as 21, you want to downrev it and match it to 20.010. Very, very important, okay? Again, this is the only version you want to use in the redundancy system. Just reminding you, see you later.
I'm glad you're mentioning all of that, Mace, because I feel like that's one area that people don't often realize is that you need to do it in that whole kit. You need to have all the versions lined up, and that may mean upgrading or downgrading. I wasn't aware of that for quite a long time.
Yes, thank you. It's very important. Again, all these slides I made from scratch, mainly because they are just in the back of my head of why did I get the call, and then how can I help somebody in the future for not make the same mistake. And I've made plenty of them. All right, again, still loaded for those exact matches. But yes, thank you, Julia. Now, not to be contradictory, just that we're talking about a different subject, software. So if you're running Vue SE, for instance, you can see that version 11 is supported. This is a minimum now. So this is what we're used to seeing. It has to be this or later. That's totally fine when you're not talking about firmware. This is about the software. Or if you're running Asset Center, version 9 supports the firmware kit of redundancy 32051. Okay, if you have 8, you should really upgrade. Otherwise, you might have issues with Factory Talk Asset, let's say, the older versions. All right. Stressing again, this is a minimum requirement, unlike the firmware discussion we just talked about. And to help you when you get these slides, you can click, this is the normal place you go for any firmware nowadays. They've done a great job consolidating it, the compatibility Rockwell Automation pages. Okay. Now, this is out of the 1756 UM535 manual specifically. I shrunk it down and summarized it for you. Simply, you're going to grab the first rack and power supply, screw them together. You're going to grab the first set of communication modules, grab the first rack's controller, the first redundancy module, the RM2. You'll plug in the fiber optic cables, and then you want to power it up. Now, this is just the first rack we're talking about for the pairs of hosts. I put this first, even though you do it last. You're going to load the firmware into the RM2 module last. But I want to tell you it now because if you start grabbing things and going into the next step, for instance, this, you might get yourself into something you'd have to fool around with to get it to sync up. So again, do control flash, do all the modules except for the RM2 goes last. Okay? Next, now you want to set up your IP addresses. ControlNet is a little more funky. Very often it has to be the lowest node and all of that, but IP addresses really doesn't matter anymore, which is great. So determine what IP addresses are free and you want to use, and you're going to set the secondary to the same address. I'll talk about that in a moment. Same with ControlNets, okay? So power off the first rack, power on the second rack, do the same repeat. Load all the firmware, again, RM2 is last, power off the second rack. Plug in the fiber optic cables to connect the RM2s together. So now you have both racks sitting there, powered off, you plug the RM2s together. Again, with power off, hesitate, and now power up the one you want to be the primary. If it was still the first one you did and you kept everything in order, no problem, great, power it up. But it's important to wait until the RM2 module displays primary. In some instances, this could be 3 minutes, 5 minutes, depends how many communication modules and all that. It is suggested you don't have an Ethernet switch or anything connected while you're initially setting these up, okay? Now, apply the power to the second rack. This becomes a B rack. Does make sense why I'm talking about A and B in a moment, but I have a slide that shows that. Then, excuse me? Oh, okay. All other modules, such as the input modules again, output modules, they're all remotely controlled. There's nothing else going in these modules, okay? Now, some people, which I'm very thrilled to hear, I sometimes get a call saying, look, I want to have the primary and secondary in the same cabinet. That's okay. You can separate them and you can make your own fiber cables. The Rockwell ones go up to 30 meters. Maybe those are long enough, but you can make up your own. One biggie here is LC connectors are the same, but they are single mode. Those of you know our fiber connectors and other devices, the switches, most of the time it's multi-mode. These need single mode connections. So at the moment, you should see this. You'll see that channel 2 blink back and forth. This is all good in health. Primary and secondary, as you can see. I'm going to accelerate a little bit because of time. The bottom is all red. That would be a problem. We'll look into that. All right, let's get started. Again, Studio 5000 matches whatever firmware. So if you did a 32 firmware load and all the components in that kit that I just showed, then of course you'd use version 32 of Studio 5000. No special software. Create or open the project you have. If it is an existing project, just a few things to keep in mind. Event tasks, unicast, motion control, and the firmware supervisor are not supported in today's versions of redundancies, okay? Now, ADC does work. If you've seen some of my videos on the ADC, it will replace all the parameters, just not the firmware itself. For instance, my example is 525 drive. You can still add devices hot. So if you're in run mode in ControlLogix Redundancy and you want to add a 525 drive, you can do that hot. It's just like an online edits, that still works. But again, the firmware will not be supported in the redundant setup. You can also do 1756 IO, remotely chassis, add them hot, and all of that, just like you can in the single mode setup for ControlLogix. Now, we're really excited about this. The L8s, I mentioned earlier on some slides, the L8s will be supported in version 33. We're expecting this literally any week. It could be this week. I honestly didn't check this morning. I meant to. But version 33 is going to support the L8. Those of you that know how redundancy works, in the L7s and previous versions, you have to have enough memory and double it when you go to redundancy. The L8 rids that. So we're going to not have that kind of consumption of the memory because one of the cores in the L8s takes care of that. It is expected that we will not be able to use the onboard Ethernet module, Ethernet port on the L8 on the first revision of 33. Other than that, it's very, very exciting that we're going to start supporting these longev controllers. All right, I promised some screenshots what it looks like. If you're in the controller properties, notice how there's a checkbox up there that says redundancy able. That is the only thing you have to change. So if you have an existing project, you know it has no tasks and all these other, event tasks and all these other things come into play, you literally just hit the checkbox and you'll be able to download it to the redundancy system. Monitoring. These are four different displays that the RM2 LED will show, okay? The primary and sync I talked about, but disqualified and qualifying, if you will, in the process of is okay. Those are not usually a problem unless it's hanging there for minutes upon minutes. So in other words, if you set this all up and you see either disqualified or qualifying, those bottom two abbreviations there, then you have to look into something. But it's normal if you just do a switch and then while the secondary is being requalified, you'll see those kind of indications there. Back into Ars Lynx. I mentioned that Lynx Classic has a redundancy module. Well, yes. You should find that the later version of Ars Lynx Classic will already install this module. Sometimes it doesn't, so make sure you're aware that the redundancy kit will have this. Either way, you need to have the RMCT installed. This is really just an extension with Ars Lynx Classic and pretty transparent. You're going to be in Ars Lynx Classic. You're going to right-click the module configuration, and you'll see this. This is the first tab. Just giving you revision information, some of the namings. Then you'll start seeing chassis IDs. So earlier I talked about how the first rack on the left, you probably want to make chassis A and then the one on the right B, or if they're in different cabinets, either way. This is where you could change, if you didn't do it the way you wanted initially, to change the chassis A and chassis B. You cannot have two chassis A's or two chassis B's. So you do want to make sure that you dequalify these, desynchronize them, unplug the RM2s. It's a few stages if you have to flip those, but it's not that bad. You may want to go in here on your own anyways, just to see some of the other screens after you set it up, and at minimum set the workstation, just like you would on a controller. Just another screen talks about how you could initiate a switchover or disqualify if you had to do some of those chassis changes I talked about. Status of what's going on, all good. You'll see synchronize, and all that kind of stuff. Then you'll see a whole log on the event log of information that occurs during all this process. And then if you're looking for any updates and comments and things like that, which is commands, which is pretty cool. And then of course, events as well. More information that you hardly ever need to do nowadays. I think in the older days, some of you that have done this before probably had to go in there a lot because you had trouble getting the synchronization, or you had control net issues. It can be funky in the older versions. I find this new version 31 and 32, they really nailed a lot of stuff. All right, a couple final things. I'll try to be quick here. Just a reminder, this is what you should see, okay? Primary and second sync, that's all good. You'll see the channel 2 blink back and forth. If you have both fiber cables plugged in, they're healthy. Quick reminder of the limits, version 31 and 32, 2 PLCs, 7 communication modules. ADC will work except for the firmware part. Heal time, I did some fooling around when I had a demo back in March, I think it was, or February. I just simply turned off the primary, turned it back on, and it healed in 2 minutes. Secondary took about 30 seconds or a little more to give up after the primary was synced. In other words, when it crosses over, if you went into links, for instance, and caused a crossover and everything's healthy and powered and all that, this is the time that sync took to check itself and then be ready to be capable of accepting a crossover again. DLR is fully supported. Can't stress enough. You can set this up. Excuse me. It's really nice to have your supervisor and your backup supervisor as the primary and secondary Ethernet modules in your primary racks, host racks. Where do you start? Minimum bill of materials. You need a couple controllers at least, 2 communication modules, such as an EN2TR, a couple of racks. They can be any size, A4, A17, doesn't matter. It has to be the same kind though, okay. Power supplies for the racks, RM2 modules. Those cables, again, they go up to 10 meters if you want the Allen Bradley pre-made ones. And then of course end slots, whatever, to fill those in. Sample code. Now, when you see a redundancy system, it's natural you want to see the primary on the left and the sync or secondary on the right. If it crosses over, there's nothing in the hardware or firmware to make it flip back. It just figures it's going to run forever. If any of you have been down to the process unit at Easton, it does not cross over automatically, but I found that kind of a natural thing that you'd want to have it set to left. So if switchover occurs, again, it will stay whatever is in process. So if it goes from the left to the right is the primary, the secondary is going to remain on the left forever. Unless you go to the RS Links Classic and hit Initiate Switchover in the Synchronization tab. The other option is you can use my code. You're certainly welcome to this. Let's have a conversation before I give it to you. In short, it uses the GSV file to look at the status and see what rack is the primary or A chassis, in this case, which is number 1 and which is number 2. So I just have a quick little code to flip it by. It's monitoring the health of it, and after, and I usually do 10 seconds, it depends. It will basically make that, if it's healthy, primary rack become back to the primary one. I'm sorry, on the left. This is just the tags that are in there. Okay, if you want even more protection, even for a non-redundancy system, there are dual power supplies available. You have a chassis power supply adapter on the right, 2 power supplies. They're always powered at the same time. It's completely bumpless if one of them fails. And there's status or health wires you can connect to the power supplies. Again,
do you recommend the redundant power supplies?
Excuse me?
Do you recommend the redundant power supplies?
Well, a lot of people don't get this because they have the redundant racks. So it really comes down if this is a specification where they have to have redundant. Like very often, the spec we looked at the other day said everything has to have redundant power supplies, even with redundant controllers. So that would give you a redundant connection. So it's power supplies are probably one of the most likely things to wear out and fail. So yes, I would say if you have the budget for it, I would put a pair of these on each host for the redundant racks.
And those power supplies, they can be wired remotely. They don't have to attach directly to the rack in that application.
They do have a custom cable that goes between each power supply to that chassis adapter module.
Okay.
Yes, because there's a whole health thing going on. There's a particular current level that's transmitted. In other words, they have to be fairly close. I want to say they're 3 meters or less.
Okay.
And then these are just the I/O that can be supported. And that's pretty much it. Sheesh, just within an hour, huh? Here's my contact information, everybody, if you want to write it down. And yes, please ask any other questions you have.
Yeah, we didn't have anything come in on the chat, but if anybody has any other questions, feel free to ask them now. I hope this helps provide some of the detail behind redundancy. I apologize for the baby crying in the background. All right, if there's no other questions, feel free to contact us at any time. And also, Mace has up there a group email address. It's actually automationteam@rumsey.com, but feel free to use that at any point if you'd like to get a hold of any of the automation specialists. And with that, we will go ahead and let you guys get on with your day and end this session. Hope you found it valuable. Thank you.